Good evening, beautiful people. Just decided to tap back in. I know it's been a long time since I came to you, but I decided to log in this evening and just share a little perspective, a little thoughts that I've been having over the last couple of days about a specific topic. So if you have any thoughts, ideas, or perspectives on the matter, go ahead and drop your comments below and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Today's topic is going to be about physical discipline, aka whoopings. Discipline is one of those topics where almost everyone has an opinion. If most of the opinions come from people's personal experiences, many of us grew up in households where physical discipline, often called whoopings, was not only common but expected. It was seen as love, as correction, as preparation for the world. And for some people, it worked, or at least it felt like it did. But fast forward to today, and the same form of discipline is increasingly questioned, restricted, and in some cases criminalized. Laws have changed, research has evolved, social norms have shifted. What was once considered responsible parenting now, in some spaces, is viewed as harmful or outdated. So the question becomes, what changed? Was physical discipline actually effective, or was it simply accepted? Were previous generations building character or compliance? Are are modern approaches to parenting producing healthier children or just different challenges? Today, I'm not here to shame parents or to glorify pain. I'm here to talk honestly about discipline from my perspective. What is supposed to be taught, where the lines between correction and harm lie, and why this conversation hits differently depending on culture, class, and lived experiences. This is about power, protection, accountability, and love. And like most things worth discussing, the truth probably isn't simple. So, off the record and on my mind, let's talk about it. So, I want to begin this episode with an early childhood memory. Okay. So, I couldn't have been no more than about 4 years old. And it was right after Halloween time because I had a big brown paper bag of candy. And I remember at that point in time, I was living at my grandmother's house with my mother and a couple of other relatives. And my mother was off at work, and my grandmother had gave me the opportunity to go into my bag of goodies and pick out a certain amount of candy, and then she told me to put the rest up. And so, like any conniving child, right, ate the candy up, went and played for a little bit, looked around, didn't see my grandmother anywhere around, and so I had this bright idea. I was going to go get some more candy. And so I went and got more candy, and my grandmother found out that I was in the bag of candy. And so she gave me a whooping and took my candy and put it away somewhere so that I couldn't get it. I remember really, really being upset, like really, really upset about it, and at that point in time, I didn't understand why I was getting a whooping. I am able to look back in retrospect now and to recognize that when you're young and you're being disciplined, especially if you were born in the 1900s like me, most of the time physical discipline didn't come with a set of sit down and I'm going to explain to you why you're getting this whooping. It was just you got the whooping as a consequence for undesirable actions. And so I remember not really understanding why I got the whooping, but being very, very pissed off. And so after, crying in the day room for a little while, I came out into my grandmother's dining room and decided that I was going to be invisible, decided I didn't want to have to deal with my grandmother that day. And so I crawled up underneath her dining room table, and she had a big dining room table and had a very, very long dining room tablecloth. And on top of the dining room table were goodies. She was a baker at that point in time, retired, and so well, close to retirement, I'm sorry, but loved to bake. And so she had a bunch of goodies. She used to always make stuff like peanut brittle and upside down cakes and peach cobblers and all kind of things. So she had various goodies on top of the dining room table. I remember sitting underneath the dining room table just sulking, and I was fuming. I was steaming. And the dining room table went down long enough to where it covered up most of my body, but I could still see out of the bottom. And so I would see people walking by, family members walking by from the kitchen to their room or in the living room and out the door or down the stairs into the basement. I remember sitting there sulking about getting my butt whooped. And I remember looking around behind me and I saw a brown paper bag. And so, I kind of crawled up underneath there, grabbed the paper bag, played with it for a little bit, and wasn't really satisfied with that. So then I crawled back out underneath the dining room table. Was no one in the living room, and I just kind of looked around, and I noticed that my grandmother had a ashtray on one of the end tables by her couches. And so I went over and I looked, and someone had left a lighter on the actual table. So I grabbed the lighter, run back underneath the table, dive underneath the table. I'm underneath there, and I come up with this bright idea that I'm just gonna burn up. I'm just gonna set the paper bag on fire. Now I remember this at this age, having this on my mind because it was I was very, very intentional with this. I understood that lighting the paper on fire was going to create a fire because my grandmother also had a fireplace, and she had groomed my older cousin to create the fire. And then I was still going through the process. Sometimes they would let me light the little piece of paper and throw it onto the fire place pit, and then the logs would catch on fire, the kindling and such and so forth, and then the fire would happen. And so I understood that by lighting up this paper bag, it was going to create fire. And somehow I just back in my mind, the thought of me getting spanked again really, really entered into my mind. And I got mad. And I remember saying, you know what? If she won't give me my candy, then I'm gonna burn up the dining room table. Because again, the dining room table had a bunch of sweets up on the top of it. And so I lit the paper bag on fire, watched it start, reached over and put it next to the dining room table cloth and watched it start. Now, once that thing got going, it got going super fast. I remember being absolutely startled. It didn't at all go like what happened in the fireplace with the killing taking a few minutes, seconds to start, and then the fire spread. Like immediately, the tablecloth was on fire. And all I could think of at that point in time was to bail out. So I rolled out from underneath the dining room table and ran into my grandmother's day room and closed the door. And I thought that was the end of it. Now, I remember hearing my grandmother come out, and I can't recall who else is in the house. I believe it was one of my uncles. And so I heard them, talking about going to get something to put the fire out. And before long, as a matter of fact, I believe it was one of my uncles who has since passed away. But they put the fire out, and I remember hearing my grandmother stomping around, and I remember laying my back up against the door, like as if my little body was going to be able to stop the door from opening up. But my grandmother, grabbed the door handle and seeing that, felt that I was on the back of the door and told me to open the door. I didn't say anything. I just immediately started crying. So she, forced her way into the door, knocked me on the ground, and she went and grabbed her switch because she kept her a switch. For those of you that may not know, the switch is it's a long piece of tree or tree branch or bush branch that all of the leaves have been removed, and all you have is the actual wooden branch. Or if you had the kind of bushes that kind of had like vine kind of plants, you could still pull that off and strip away the leaves, and it was a little bit softer because it was the green vine, which actually hurt and it left a whelp on you more than the switch did. But I remember she went and got her switch, came in, and she gave me a whooping. And then she stormed out, and I remember getting up and climbing up on the little couch and curling up in the ball and crying myself to sleep, thinking that that was the end of it. But that wasn't the end of it, because after that, I don't know how much longer, I would assume an hour or two later, one of my uncles, her oldest son, came in the room, and he was yelling and cussing and screaming. Obviously he was pissed off that I had set the tablecloth on fire and was like, he gonna burn down the house. And so he gave me a whooping. He took his belt off of his belt loop of his pants and gave me a whooping with the belt until my grandmother came in and of course told him that was enough. He got, quite a few swings in. And again, I laid there, holding on to my legs and my behind and my back, and cried myself to sleep again. And I remember sleeping for quite a while. I remember my mother coming in. I remember hearing her voice from the other room. And so, my head popped up real fast. And I remember really, really feeling like I can't wait for her to come in. I'm going to tell her that my grandmother took my candy from me and that's why I set the tablecloth on fire. In my mind, I thought that, that's mom. She's going to take my side. She's going to protect me. She'll understand where I was coming from. And I remember my mother coming in and yelling and screaming at me, and she gave me a whooping, which would be the third whooping in the same day, with her hand. She came in and gave me a spanking, with her hand and walked out. And so I share this story because this is my earliest memory of actually being physically disciplined. I'm sure somewhere before that I may have gotten a swat on the butt or I may have gotten hit, popped with a switch or a spoon, but that sticks out to me as I'm telling the story. I can really, really think about what I was contemplating in the moments. I can still recall what the room looked like. I can't remember the clothing I had on, but I can remember, how I looked at 3 or 4 years old, little skinny, light skinned, big head boy with a big head full of hair, big afro. Um, and so I say that to say I grew up in a household where physical punishment was a normal response to undesired behavior. And so um, I weigh in on the side of thinking that physical discipline has the time and place in a household. I do feel like there definitely needs to be restraint. There has to be some a thought process, a game plan. I'll share with you all what my strategy was of lording over my household when my children were younger, and I'll share my perspectives on what I think the difference is between that old school form of discipline and what I see in the society around me today. And perhaps I'll share some biases, but also I'm going to be willing to kind of look at what the counter argument is and see if I can kind of see some rationale in that. Okay. So with that being said, what I also want to do right here is I want to start out with looking at I did a little Google search. I live here in the liberal state of California, and my curious question was, is it legal to still physically whoop your children? And so I did a little Google search, and so I want to start out by reading what it says about that. So going to my handy dandy document. So in California, spanking or whooping a child is not inherently illegal if it is considered reasonable physical discipline that does not result in injury. However, it becomes a crime if the force used is excessive, cruel, or results in any kind of physical injury or traumatic conditions, such as wounds, bruises, or internal injury, even if the injury is minor. So I'll continue this and I'll come back and I'll give my commentary. California Penal Code Section 273D makes it a serious offense to willingly inflict cruel or inhumane corporal punishment or an injury upon a child, which can be charged as a misdemeanor or a felony. The key distinctions between legal discipline and illegal child abuse often depend on one, reasonableness. The punishment must be reasonable form of discipline for the circumstances and the child's age. Two, lack of injury. The discipline should not cause any physical harm, marks, or bruising. Causing a visible injury can lead to a legal child abuse conviction. And lastly, lack of effectiveness. Using an object like a belt or a paddle is not automatically illegal, but the force must not be excessive. So let's start with my thoughts on that. I think that although this is not the actual California Penal Code, it's been summarized. I can see that there's so much subjectivity and then there's some unrealistic elements to it, right? So let's start with the fact that to actually give a physical spanking, whether it's with your hand or it's with an object, is probably going to leave some sort of mark on a child. And so the first thing that comes to mind with me is that that's where the first part of the gray area is. If it's not illegal in the state of California to physically discipline your child, um, one of the key elements of physical discipline is to inflict some sort of pain. Now, the difference between pain and injury, I don't really think is a huge debate. Yes, I come from a long line of playing sports, and so I remember sometimes I'd be laying on the ground, and the coach would say, "Hey, are you hurt or are you injured?" And so my thought process on the differences is both of them require you to feel and experience pain, right? Hurt is just something that is momentary, something that you can work your way through physically and emotionally, and then before you know it, you're back up and you're at it, and there's absolutely no lingering effects or nothing outside of a bruise. But being injured is, regardless of whether or not your adrenaline has kicked in or whether it's subsided, that area of trauma is going to continue to hurt for an extended period of time. And for anyone that's ever got a spanking, you definitely are going to feel some lingering effects of it. And so, I don't really recall there being too many times where I actually got physically spanked where I was injured. 99.9% of the time when I got a spanking, I was in fact hurt though, buttocks, hands, legs, wherever the pain was inflicted, that definitely hurt for a little bit. But even if it was one of those things that lasted for a couple of hours, uh, growing up in the 1900s, that was just something that was just par for the course. That was just baked into the cake, so to speak. So to hear them say that there can't be any physical marks, physical harm, or bruises, then that means that you really can't whoop your kid. I mean, I don't know how you would spank a child with the intention of correcting behavior and instilling a little bit of fear into them without it having some sort of physical effects and also having some lingering effects. I mean, obviously, by no stretch of the imagination would I ever advocate for actually injuring a child and having them actually not be able to move the limb or wherever they've experienced the spanking, having it painful to where they can't function and move around throughout the day. Again, I'm using the framework of my experiences, and so that's what I'm leaning into it with. Maybe that's one of the chief arguments as to why physical punishment should not be legal is because it does, if it's actually deployed with its intended um, consequences, is to kind of leave the child really, really thinking about what they did wrong as they're making their way physically and emotionally through the wounding and through whatever pain they're experiencing, whether it be 10 minutes or whether it be a couple hours, right? The second thing that I want to address is it says using objects like a belt or a paddle aren't automatically illegal, but if you use a belt or a paddle, you're probably going to leave some physical markings, at least temporarily, right? And so it seems to me like it says that it's not on the books illegal to spank your kid, but if you spank your kid with the intention of instilling a little bit of fear into them, then you're automatically going to cross that threshold to where you might be subject to CPS being called on you. So this seems like something that in this current day and age is just so murky, so muddy, right? So with that being said, let me hop into another thought process I had. So we are the sum of our experiences. And in the opening monologue, I said that, people tend to look at and view whether or not spankings actually were warranted and whether they were based on the outcome that they think that they have had. And so for someone that, spankings became a huge deterrent from them, they probably look at it like, well, yeah, the spankings were justified because there were so many things that I did not do, so many times that I probably would have made a bad decision. But what was first and front and center in the forefront of my mind was what were going to be the consequences of my actions, and whoever it is that was the one that was going to spank me, uh, I probably had a healthy form of fear for them, at least in regards to not really wanting to do things to get in trouble and to get a whooping. right? I can't help thinking about the fact that there are and have been these cases where, people have been abused, people have war stories and horror stories about how what could have been a simple spanking turned into something that was injurious. And so I'm not here to debate or defend or even to really touch bases on what happens when someone goes too far and they injure a child, right? In my current station in life, what I do for a living, I am a mandated reporter, and and I have been taught to be on the lookout for visible markings and psychological, social, emotional indicators that a student has been or is in the midst of being physically or emotionally abused. And so, with that being said, I understand that when people cross the line, they should be held accountable to that. And the child should not be in an environment where they're actually being brutalized, right? But then I'm also someone that grew up in the 1900s. And so I can tell you with a straight face that I am a proponent of giving whoopings, but with very, very specific things in mind. And I disciplined my children when they were young. My thought process on it and my strategy was very, very methodical. I never hit my children with inanimate objects. That was one of the things that I drew the line with because I was hit with objects. Most of my cousins that I grew up with, we were hit with objects, whether it be wooden spoons or rubber spoons or plastic spoons or race car tracks or belts or extension cords, things of that nature. Definitely got whoopings with those, and those really, really do leave whelps and a lot of pain that come along with that, especially things like the phone cords. I can remember getting whooped with phone cords when I was a kid, and those really, really do a number on them legs, especially if you got little yellow light skinned legs like mine. So I, when I would administer whooping, it was always with an open hand. It wasn't even with a belt. That's not to say that I've never ever used a belt, but using the belt was not my forte. I used the open hand. Secondly, I had a rule that my children got the same number of swats with the hand as their age. So if my son or daughter was 3 years old, they got three swats on the leg or the butt. 5 years old, five swats on the leg or the butt. And I think that that was very reasonable. And I got my point across, but then it also, without me even really thinking about it, set up this dilemma, which is at what age do you stop physically disciplining your children? And I remember around the age of 8 or 9 years old is definitely when I stopped disciplining my son physically because one, if you hit somebody with your open palm 8, 9 times, your open hand is going to start stinging. So it would actually hurt me, my hand, to spank my son as well. And he's moving around, wiggling around. My daughter, the same thing. But that was my methodical way of dealing with it. If it got to the point where I felt they deserved a whooping, and I wasn't a whoop first and ask questions later kind of person, my form of physical discipline had steps and stages, right? There was conversations had, there was a look at in the thought process as was this something new that I wanted to nip in the bud immediately, or was it something that, these little small things are starting to kind of pile up, things that they've been getting lectures and been getting restrictive type of measures placed on them, things taken away from them, and curfews and not being able to play with friends. If it was something that was a slow brew, they got a whooping. There were certain things that I definitely wanted to get ahead of. And so meeting them with a physical whooping was, in my mind, from my psychology, a way to nip that in the bud. That's not something that I want my children to even think that they can get away with doing at all, ever again. And so my psychology and my strategy for deploying weapons was definitely to try to deter them from certain types of behaviors. And so I didn't have a I'm gonna whoop you out of frustration kind of mentality. I didn't have a, you know what, I don't want to take the time to sit and talk with you about this thing, so I'm just gonna throw hands first. That was not something that was commonplace in our household. I also made a decision around the time that my daughter was about 4 or 5 years old that I wasn't going to physically discipline her, and I turned that responsibility over to her mother. And so her mother physically disciplined her under those same precepts that I just expressed for myself with my daughter, and I just handled my son. But I do know without a shadow of a doubt around the time that before the age of 10, they were no longer getting physical spankings because at that point, I felt like we had did a good job of conveying to them the things that were off limits, the things that they were not at all going to be able to do underneath our roof, the things that were going to solicit these specific types of consequences immediately. And I always was told that you spank early and often to get them to understand certain things, where there's boundaries and where they are and are not going to be able to do certain things. But then you'll be able to live off the strength of the whooping as they get older. And in my case, it absolutely worked, right? It got to the point where my children, I would see that they would actually think some of their moves, some of the things they would say to their friends, some of the decisions that they made came directly as a result of reflecting on a whooping. Is this something that they get me a whooping? If so, no, I'm not doing it. If it was something that was, uncharted territory, they might have made a bad decision. And I also try to take those things into consideration with the discipline. So, one thing that I do want to say is that I was not an angry, outraged, emotional whooping giver, right? My personality is very, very calculated, very methodical, very routinistic, and I lead in with logic and emotion second. So even when my children did something that just completely pissed me off, I would make it a point of mine to not whoop them in that moment. I would give some time. I would send them to their room or tell them something that they had to do. Sometimes I would have my son or daughter jump into some chores right away, give me some time to kind of think about and strategize how I was going to address them after they got the whooping. Then they would get the whooping that would be followed up by some sort of dialogue of some sort, letting them understand, well, letting them know until they can understand why certain things were just not going to happen on my watch, right? And so that leads me to a few things that I've heard people say that are of my age group and older, right? There's people that say, I was whooped as a child and look at me, I turned out fine, right? Um, I think that that's a very subjective statement for a number of reasons. One, that person presumes that the way that they move and how they see the world is acceptable. And in many cases, people who grow up in spaces of dysfunction, they're not even aware the level or the degree at which the dysfunction has kind of corrupted them or actually has them outwardly expressing dysfunctional thought processes and behaviors, right? So someone can say out of their mouth with a great deal of certainty, "Hey, I got a whooping and look at me, I turned out fine," but their fine is subject to who they're talking to and subject to the audience, but even if that's not the case and they're not explaining outwardly displaying and exhibiting dysfunctional behaviors, they may have grew up in a situation where their parents was a little bit more methodical or mixed some love in with the spankings and tried to explain to them and gave them a good indication as to why this form of discipline was going to be used and what the consequences were. And maybe they were able to take that in and, learn from that. But far too many times there are people that just based on their state of mind, based on whether or not they've indulged in any kind of drugs or alcohol, based on the type of environment they live in. There are lots of individuals that fly off the handle or go too far. And for too many years, children did not have any rights and there weren't supports put in place. And so it was real easy for a child back in the 1900s to be brutalized, right? And then not even know it or see it as being brutalized, right? If I were to talk to my students or talk to people that have grown up in the 21st century and talk about being whooped with a extension cord or being whooped with a thick leather belt, right? Some of them might be able to relate to it in a sense. There aren't really that many houses that have phones that have phone cords. Most people don't just have extension cords laying around anymore. There's so many things where you just plug it in, and there's the internet, there's Wi-Fi and things like that that kind of control these things that used to otherwise require an extension cord. So I'm not sure if they even understand or even have access to extension cords to be able to relate. But the reality is that there are people who just fly off the handle and are abusers. And so if a child is being disciplined by an abuser, regardless of what the intent is, chances are the child is going to be subject to abuse. And so I want to keep that into context when I hear somebody say, "Hey, I used to get whoopings and I turned out fine," because again, that's very, very subjective. And you may have just been in that minority group that actually was disciplined in a way that wasn't overboard, didn't meet the criteria for abuse. But there's so many people that wasn't as lucky, right? So I think about that when I hear somebody use that as a rationale. Um, let's talk about the intentions of a spanking, right? I believe that at the core of it and at the origins of it, it's supposed to be a deterrent. Yes, there are elements of frustration, and I can concede that sometimes people go straight to the physical aspect of discipline before they even try to work through the explanation and the teaching and leading by example, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just focus on the actual act in of itself, right? For someone that's deploying that, they're thinking, I want to use this as a deterrent. This level of harm should be just enough to where they don't want to experience it again. And so now they can reflect on it anytime it's time for them to make a decision that could have negative consequences, right? So spankings were communicated to me and I communicated to my children were used to let them know that this behavior that you're exhibiting right now is unacceptable. It's going to be met with this. The intention of this is for you to feel discomfort. It is for you to feel scared and some fearfulness. Uh, Never ever with the intention to terrorize, right, or to create this feeling of deep fear and resentment, right? And I think anyone listening to this is going to be able to understand the difference, right? For me, my household was structured where I wanted to be respected, not feared. And so that played into my decisions when and to what extent and how I was going to administer whoopings because I didn't want to create an environment where I was away and my children did something and then their mother was like, "Oh, wait till your dad get home." And have them at the forefront of their mind thinking about, when I walk through the doors, all hell is going to break loose and I am going to do extreme physical harm to them. I definitely did not want that on my profile. Even then, even coming from a generation that got disciplined in any number of ways and actually had hours worth of pain. I still had in the back of my mind that I didn't want my children to be in a state of terror in my house, especially for me. I didn't want my name to be synonymous with fear, right? And so I was very, very strategic with it. But I did want to make sure that my children had a healthy fear of what would happen if you made poor or continue to make the wrong decisions, especially decisions that was going to negatively impact your life moving forward or could have some long-term, long-lasting effects in our household, And so for me, I wanted to make sure that my son was able to understand there's certain things that he absolutely was not going to do in my household, even if that meant he had to get a spanking in order to be able to associate that negative behavior with getting a spanking. And so I was very intentional with that. I was blessed with having children that did not require continuous or constant spankings. They made lots of good choices. I do think that our decision to communicate to them why they were receiving the spanking and what things were not going to be tolerated in our household, gave them an opportunity to make these decisions, forward thinking and to anticipate with their decision making as they were making their way through childhoods, right? I felt like we did a good job with that. But I do recognize that not everyone takes this approach, right? But that's just the way it is. Another thing that I do want to touch bases on is the environment. I grew up in a community in a neighborhood where your neighbors were close to you. So much so that neighbors could be considered called aunties and uncles and second grandma, et cetera, et cetera. My mother had several friends that she would introduce to me as my aunties. They were not blood relative sisters to her, but they ran in the same circle and I played with their children, and so it was very common to be disciplined by people outside of just my mother or my grandmother, right? I lived in an environment where people were given latitude if they saw you out in public doing things that needed to be corrected to correct you, right? I didn't live in an environment where a perfect stranger would run up to you and give you a spanking for something you did, but because I grew up in the 1900s where kids were actually outside most of the day, right? There were instances where, kids just do kid things and make poor choices. And so yeah, I didn't live in a place where I would run in the house and tell my grandmother or my mom that such and such hit me and it was seen as a problem. If I ran in the house and I did tell somebody or my cousins came in and did tell them that they were receiving a pop or a swat or a spanking, the first thing that we were asked is, what did you do? Right. So there was a presumption that everyone in the community had a responsibility to kind of look after all of the neighborhood children. And so um, that was a very, very important part of the culture of spanking. Now, at the beginning, I gave you an example of getting three spankings in one day for a decision that I made. And to be honest, even to today's date, I don't really know where I land on that. I vacillate back and forth between feeling like it was excessive, but also feeling like, it did serve its purpose and it did do exactly what it was intended to do. I mean, this guy right here never, ever again had a bright idea to light a piece of paper and try to set anything in anyone's houses intentionally on fire, right? So, that trilogy of ass whoopings actually hit the mark because anytime I would even have a thought process of doing something to that extreme, I've reflected back on exactly what happened that day. And I think that that's what spankings, the deployment of spankings is about. It's about creating a lasting and reminding kind of guideline or boundary that the child is supposed to be able to reflect on and to come back and to weigh what it is that they're potentially about to do versus what could be the outcome of that decision or that indecision, right? And so those are all the things that individuals like me who are proponents of spanking say, hey, you know what, this is the intent. The intent is not to terrorize, it's definitely not to injure, but it's to prevent future and further damning behaviors from happening that outside of the household could really, really have consequences, right? We think about all the poor decisions that a young adult can make that can have some long lasting impact that follow them back into the house, as it relates to criminal activity, as it relates to bullying activity, as it relates to just doing things that um, bring shame or dishonor upon the family, right? Those are all rationales that people in the 1900s used to decide that they were going to um, uh, administer physical harm to their children with, right? So let's peep the game from a different angle. All right. So let's go ahead and look at the 21st century and how and why this psychology is no longer a commonplace and why, most people, or not most people, it's hard to quantify. It depends on who you talk to. and depends on the gender, depends on a lot of different factors, right? Depends on the type of environment. Probably determine whether or not a person is for or against physical spankings. But for individuals that are against it, right? Let's look at more the cerebral side of it, right? So, research links physical punishment to increased aggression, anxiety, and fear-based compliance. Yes, I can wrap my adult mind around those concepts absolutely, right? But again, what I think of immediately is to what degree is the spanking having an impact on the kid? If a kid is being brutalized, regardless what the intent, I think those things are going to absolutely be present in a child, right? And I'm not at all in favor of that. But looking at aggression, I can concede that the decision to spank your child is also introducing into your child's psychology this notion that under certain circumstances, uh, physical violence is justifiable and it's something that you should be able to do. Now, here's where it can definitely have negative consequences. In a child's mind or in an adolescent's mind, they don't have the same level of maturity, they don't have the same ability to rationalize as a full-fledged adult. And so to them, they probably just see aggression, they see physical violence as physical violence, right? And so yes, I can absolutely concede that there are children that once they're introduced to being spanked, their response to frustration or anger or any other negative emotion is probably going to be lashing out in a violent way. But again, that's where teaching them what is acceptable and non acceptable and who should be in positions of power to be able to exert physical violence is key. Now, in a utopian world, we would say, well, no one should ever be violent to anyone else. But the world that we live in many cases, does not lend to us actually adopting those completely non-violent methodologies, right? We do live in a world and we do live in a society where we actually have police and we have military and we have securities that is trained and able to administer violence, organized violence, for what is seen to be a greater cause. And so I only say that to say that even in societies in which they want to have harmony, they want to have compliance, they want to have some sort of balance, some sort of equilibrium. There is a time when violence is acceptable in most people's minds. Now, the issue is to each his own. Some people, their thought process on violence, the threshold of violence has to be a lot higher than others, right? But I do concede that once a child has an experience with violence, they're probably going to internalize it and play with it themselves, right? And so that needs to be addressed. They need a clear understanding of how and when to regulate that, right? Um, Studies have shown it may stop behavioral short term, but it doesn't teach them to self-regulate long term. I definitely agree with that. If you don't accompany spankings with a lot of communication as to why this is taking place and what it's meant to deter, and then also getting children to understand that there's levels to this. A One sibling should not have the authority to hit the younger sibling just because they're older, right? There should be some rules and regulations in place for what I guess we would call legal spankings. And I think that without having communication going hand in hand with that, it's going to definitely increase the likelihood of having negative outcomes and creating young adults that lash out with violence whenever they're experiencing some sort of discomfort or any kind of negative emotions, right? So I absolutely recognize that if it's just done um, haphazardly Or if you're one of those parents that's like, you know what, I don't owe my kids any kind of explanation at all. They do what I say. I lord over them. This my way, the highway. I brought you in this world. I'll take you out. You know, all those expressions. Your spankings probably are going to produce an unintended outcome in your children. You know, just from my vantage point. Secondly, physical discipline can escalate easily, especially under stress. People in this world in the 21st century are under so much more stress than ever before. I can absolutely take stock in that. Growing up in the 1900s was totally different than growing up in the 21st century. The level of scrutiny, the level of access, the ways in which young people can be humiliated publicly are so much more profound than when I was coming up. You know, when I was coming up, if a kid wanted to fight with you and said, "Meet me at the gate outside of the school premises at 3:30," you show up, you might, with a big name brawl, you might get 30, 40 students there, right? But in the 21st century, you know, people with people pulling out their phones, like someone can humiliate and ruin, you know, your young life as you're growing up. Somebody do you dirty in the streets and it's on camera and it gets put on the internet. It can have so much more psychological damage done, right? So I get that. So with that being said, with people being under so much more stress these days than before in the more simpler day times, I don't really think that parents really regulate when they spank. And I think that that's a huge issue. If you don't have a game plan, if you don't have self accountability in your hand, if you're not aware of what your hand is in the act, that it's not just you simply physically disciplining your child, but you're creating a set of um, what's the word I'm looking for? You're creating an understanding, right? You're shaping how your child looks at organized violence and also how they look at you and how you deploy it. And it's more of those, more in the line of not do what I say is do what I do. So if they see that you're easily irritable and you go right to spanking and violence just because you're stressed out, something that otherwise would have just garnered you just giving them a conversation or taking something away, if it just turns into an act of violence and rage just because you're stressed out. I believe that, yeah, you're putting yourself in your household in a position to where spankings are probably going to be so much more problematic and probably so much more injurious to your children, right? So the fact that people in this day and age that you know are more knee-jerk response oriented maybe is one of those things that is enough to say, hey, maybe we should put this spanking thing on pause, or at least let's just redefine and let's reshape the parameters in which somebody can do that lawfully, right? What's another thing? What one parent considers a whooping, another may see as harm. That's absolutely, yeah, there's so much gray area in that, right? And you know, there are people that feel like hearing someone shout and raise their voice at their children means that they're out of control and that, you know, their children are in harm's way, and you know, someone might come to their aid and think that they need to intervene and to be honest, I don't really know where I land on that. First thing that comes to mind, you know, we do live in the world of the Karen. We do live in a society where Karen is alive and well. And so there's this attitude, you know, don't tell me what to do with my children. Don't tell me what I can and cannot do. And I don't have to be held to the same standard that you have to be held in your household. You know, what's good, what's going on in your household, it can be dramatically different than what's going on in my household. And who's to say who's right? You know, again, going back to the 1900s, you know, in an environment where people had an idea that, you know, more people were spanked in that place, you know, as a community, you can get spankings. And it was just accepted. It's built into the cultural fabric of that day and age. Now there's just so much parity, you know. Somebody coming over and taking something from their child in a public place, you know, admonishing them in public might be something that someone's like, oh, this isn't tolerable. You shouldn't be doing this out in public. And so I can see where it's become problematic. There's really no black and white, right? It's just so many shades of gray. that you just never know. You know, someone might call CPS or someone might call the police on you for doing something that, in your mind and from your vantage point is not at all something that meets that level of care and concern. But for someone that maybe grew up in a household where there was absolutely no spanking, or on the flip side, grew up in a space where there was utter violence and chaos, that might trigger them. And in their thought, in their mind, it's like, hey, I can't allow another child to potentially go through the things that I went through. So the fact that society doesn't have an equilibrium, in my opinion, with spankings, I can see how now it's become a lot more problematic, right? The legal shifts that have taken place, right? Child welfare system, to step in early and often is again, I said, I'm a mandated reporter. I have to be vigilant. I have to have my head in a swivel. I have to be able to make determinations on the spot when a young person comes to my classroom as to whether or not I feel like they've been in a hazardous environment, right? We're trained to look at and to spot certain things that maybe to the average person or to the naked eye just don't stand out. I don't have that luxury of doing that. It's baked into my job, and I'm legally bound, right? And so this whole thought process that, if you don't act on certain things, then you can legally be held responsible for the welfare of that child just because they've come into your presence. That's something that's a reality in my life, right? And so, for me, I say, the less spankings, the better my job is because again, I don't really want to have to step in there and play detective and try to figure out, to what degree this was something that was legal versus something that was illegal and injurious to the child. But that's the world that we live in, or at least that's the world that I live in right now. So I can also concede that, the legal framework is kind of ambiguous, even though they've put language and literature together that's supposed to be used as a framework or a guideline. It still leaves too much subjectivity in play. And so, with that being said, that's what makes whoopings nowadays problematic, right? If I were walking out of my place of employment and going to my car and I seen a parent, deciding that they were going to discipline their child, I have to slow my pace. I have to turn my attentions towards that. And what has to be on the forefront of my mind is being able to observe whether or not I feel like that child is in a space to where they're going to be injured. Has that parent reached that threshold where their physical or verbal discipline has now met the criteria that now I have to physically file a complaint on behalf of the child. So the society has changed. There's lots of jobs, lots of civil service jobs in which they require you to be mandated reporters. And so the society has felt the ripple effect of that. Parents have felt really, really constrained and really, really felt like people are all in their business. Whereas in the past, in the last in the last 30, 40 years, there was this thought process that, I can invite you into sharing in the responsibility, helping me to rear my child, that village mentality. But then I could also say, you know what, this is my child. Don't tell me what to do with my child. Like this is, not actually, and I would never use it as in this term as property, but there was this understanding that the child was under the care of the parent. And so the parent was able to administer punishment how he or she seen fit, so long as it doesn't meet those thresholds that the law actually spells out black and white that they can't do. And so I can see how, because the laws have changed and because, I can see that most people don't take the time to kind of figure out what the laws are in their city, in their state, things that can dramatically impact them with one wrong decision made, that kind of lends towards this attitude that maybe we should just put down spankings because they're not being done in a responsible and in a loving way and in a precise way to elicit a certain kind of response. So since that's not the case, they're no longer welcomed. It's not something that should be a commonplace in our society, right? Critics also argue that physical discipline teaches children that violence is an acceptable way to resolve conflicts. I think since the beginning of time, um, there's been social Darwinism. You know, yeah, if someone is abused, for sure, they're going to develop some habits and they're going to develop some defense mechanisms that are going to uh, be physical, for sure. But I also know that there's a social pecking order. And so, regardless of what someone has experienced, I don't think that that person would turn around and be and exhibit a certain level of violence to any and everyone. It would definitely be someone that they felt that they could brutalize and probably get away with it. It would definitely be somebody that they felt that was lower on the social pecking order than them. And so I say it to say I'm not so convinced that it just creates a whole society of violent people because, there was this old adage, people know who to play with and who not to play with. You know who you can get away with doing certain things with and who you can't get away with. But I can't help but to think that if we don't teach children how to defend themselves, then that is the real injustice. That's the real letdown that we're having, and so that's kind of woven in a little bit as well. And the reason why I say that is because I feel like violence is violence is violence, right? When you are physically doing something to someone else, it's going to be subjective, right? And depending on who you are, depending on your social status, depending on the environment, depending on the circumstances, the outcome can be different from one person to the next. But I don't think that we can live in a society where we're completely devoid and absent of violence. I don't think that that would create harmony, right? And so I understand that there has to be a way to teach young people self-regulation. There has to be a way to especially for young boys, there has to be something put in place that's going to teach emotional intelligence, right? And there has to be things other than just sports that show them how to harness aggression and how to use organized violence to be able to achieve a team goal or to get ahead in a sport, right? I think that being able to teach someone how to responsibly defend themselves with violence is something that all societies should have in place, right? The reality is that there are bad people amongst us. There are people that are villains. There are people who are abusers. There's people who are takers. There's people that do the worst kind of thing to people that they think will allow them to get away with it with. And so the reality is we can tell, we can be responsible, we can go and we can try and go the legal route, but sometimes where the rubber meets the road, you have to be able to use violence, even as a deterrence to future violence. So what I'm saying that to say is as it relates to spankings, I think that you're definitely introducing violence to a young person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all anyone that is exposed to violence is going to be out of control and just turn into a violent maniac kind of person, right? And so, you know, the jury is out on that, but I do know because I've been blessed. I've been blessed enough to live planet Earth for multiple decades. I've been blessed to be able to see shifts in societal norms and mores, and I can definitely look at two actions, the same action in two different timelines and see how they have they're viewed totally differently now. And so, that's a great thing that comes along with being able to live to be a certain age. Like you get a chance to see and to think and to see how things around you change. You know, and so I'm thankful for that. Um, the reason why I land on the side of being a proponent for physical disciplining a child has a lot to do with what I see in today's day and age. I see so many young people have no respect for their parents. And I'm not saying that the only way that you can earn respect from your child is to beat it in or out of them, right? But I do think that if a child does not have any fear whatsoever of the parent, it is going to show up in very, very negative and very, very dangerous consequences. Um, I see on a daily basis the difference between a child's conduct typically is being driven by the power dynamic between them and their parent or their guardians, period. So for young people that have no fear or respect for their parent, they're going to try to treat and handle anyone they come across in a terrible way. And so that's what leads me to a thought process that if children at an early age are taught these boundaries through physical punishment, then that may serve more of a deterrent from them doing some of the things that I see them doing now, right? There's certain things that have always happened since the beginning of time. There's been mischievous young people all throughout time immemorial. There have been bullies or people that take advantage or exploit other people. That will never change. But as a teacher of many years now, I see so many instances where the child's behavior seems to be very consistent in the school as what it is in the home. And that's the part that troubles me because that's not to say that children that are displaying these type of negative behaviors in school have not been physically punished at all. But I'm saying that more often than not, if the child doesn't receive any type of physical discipline at all, chances are their level of cautious fear and respect for their parent or guardian definitely is typically lowered. There's just certain things that a parent that is a whooping parent is just not going to allow to happen on their watch. And it shows up even when their child is being mischievous, that child still knows. They'll still hang their head. They'll still understand that there's going to be consequences that may not happen right there in the schoolhouse, but they're en route and they're going to be dealt with in some way, shape, or form. And you can see that in their demeanor and their body language when they have their parent around. But there's still so many instances where my heart goes out to the parent because the parent is literally being bullied by the kid. And I had to ask myself time in and time out, how does one find themselves in that kind of situation? Right. I'm not at home with them. I don't know. I don't walk a step in their shoes, but I have been on planet Earth long enough to understand that there are certain things that go hand in hand. And chronic misbehavior, chronic poor choice making, and a lack of respect for any and every adult is usually found in the child where in the household their parent has not been able to establish that and establish some sort of power dynamic in their household. And so I'm not naive enough to say that it's just 100% approval rating. Any parent that spanks their kid is going to be a model student when they leave the house. Like I get that, but just for the sake of the numbers, I think that more students, and I say students because I have been in this profession for a long time, and this is just like some of the things that we have to be conscientious about as educators, right? We have to look at power dynamics that students have with their parents because we're trying to partner with parents. We're trying to build alliances with parents to be able to support children and to be able to be there for them as they make their way through adolescence, right? Until they can get to a point where they're making a lot of the decisions on their own. And so there has to be a little bit of awareness. And I'm also a parent myself. And so that threshold is met between an educator and a parent. And so when I sit and I talk and I interface with parents, I look at and just pay close attention. I don't pass judgment and I don't condemn them and all that. I'm not calling balls and strikes, but part of my job is when communicating with parents, I just try to figure out, what is their ideologies at home, what are their sets of expectations of their child, and what are some of the things that they are willing to do to help support me with trying to help to create a better outcome in my classroom with said student, right? So they go hand in hand. And so I'm in this business, and so I think about this all the time. But I'm not here to say that it's 100% foolproof. I'm not even here to say it's 75% foolproof. But what I do know from experience is that when I do meet a young person in the street or in mentorship or in the classroom or just out in the environment and they have no regard for authority whatsoever, um, it's extreme. It's either they were extremely abused and so they're like, fuck it. This is what I know. This is my villain origin story and this is all I know, or they did not have any type of physical discipline in their home. And so you can only take away so many things. You can only have so many lectures. You can only, sit and try to appeal to their sensibility, with words for so long before they learn how to just sit and listen to it. Like, okay, I'm gonna get the lecture, and the mom and dad will probably take away my video game or my phone, but I'll get it back. That's another thing that I have the privilege, distinct privilege to doing. Since I'm around young people all day, I'm in that population, that segment of the population of people, adults that actually understand how kids really think and feel. Because students are away from home when they're in school for longer than they are at home. The way that they act outside of school, outside of home, can be totally different than when they do when they're at home around their parent. And I hear so many parents that are like, "Oh no, I know my child and I know my children wouldn't," and that may be true. There are some very, very in tune parents. There's a segment in the population of parents that are so in tune with their children, and they really, really take a great deal of pride in trying to create those connections and to create that kind of relationship where there's a constant communication back and forth. But for the majority of parents, they seem to have no clue about what their kids really, really think about them or about their circumstances because kids get together in the classroom, and if you let them, they'll sit and they'll talk, they'll tell everybody's business. Kids will sit and tell everything that goes on at the house, right? And so it's not for me to intervene. If I see that a conversation is going into space where I'm not comfortable, yeah, I'll intervene real quick with the authoritarian role in the classroom and say, hey, this is not the time and place for that. You guys can't talk about that, this, and that. But sometimes I just sit and I listen because I'm also thinking about the fact that I had children that I had a certain set of expectations for them in my household, and they conducted themselves in a certain way and manner in front of me and their mom, but we sent them out into society. And so I was always curious to know how they really, really felt about, or how their child rearing and what their real thought processes were about, social dynamics around them. And so being an educator has really, really pulled back the wool from my eyes that these young people, they know a lot. They have their own opinions about certain things, the things that you think that they're not aware of, they're definitely aware of. And then there's a lot of misconceptions about things because the person that's in that position in their life didn't take the time to try and explain it to them. Like sometimes I will, on the behalf of a parent, if a student is expressing something to teacher that, because that's a role that I actively engage in, with the best of intentions. I handle all of my students the way I would have wanted a teacher to handle my son or daughter. That's my leading in, that's my framework. And so, students trust me and I'm very, very careful. I never uh knowingly put myself in a position where I'm going to go into be admonishing their parent or telling them something that when they go home to mom and dad can be like, well, who the hell is this guy to tell you this about me? So, I know how to navigate through these conversations, but there are certain times where I can conclude immediately that the student sees it this way just because there wasn't the communication. And when I say, well, based on what you're expressing and what you're saying to everyone, so now it's public business, I think the reason why they did this or said that was because this. And then I hear, oh, they'd be like, oh, straight for real. And so that tells me sometimes that when you just don't have that conversational piece, when you don't develop that kind of relationship to where there's constant and clear communication, sometimes young people are just left up to make decisions on how they see things just based on their own perception. And most of the time, they're going to be absolutely wrong on that, right? So I just say all this to say that the world has always been a crazy place. Every generation says that their generation was the best generation with everything. And I also have settled into realizing that when you've been raised to do or see things a certain way, it's kind of hard to give up those things because it's kind of like giving up a piece of who you are. It's kind of devaluing how you see the things around you when you were growing up to have to say, hey, well, the way that we did this back then was all fucked up. Most people don't really want to get to that depth of, real self-analysis and in this case, societal analysis. But I do feel like if used correctly and used with a great deal of intention and specificity, that um, whooping your child can have more positive outcomes than negative ones, right? I'll stand by that. So, with that being said, what says you, young people, and anyone else that's listening, anyone else that has the thought process about it, go ahead and leave your comment below. I'll get back to it. Hopefully, this has sparked a little dialogue, with you and someone else, or maybe it's just something that you've been thinking about yourself, and now I just been throwing some things on the table for you to kind of figure out for yourself, especially if you still have minors in your household and you're still figuring out how you're going to parent them into adulthood, right? So, with that being said, if you were here with me until this point, thank you for rocking with me. Until the next episode, peace.